Okay, hello, welcome to lecture 19. This is the first lecture in the concluding sequence of lectures in modern political theory. We'll be dealing with the political, economic, and social thought of Karl Marx, and Marx will see us through to the end of the semester, so we're entering here on the final phase. There's a picture of Marx when he was younger. This portrait was taken when he was age 21, so probably about the same age as many of you listening to this. This is what Marx would have looked like had you been sitting across the aisle in the lecture theatre as his undergraduate classmate at the University of Bonn. Looks quite dashing there, but of course very different from the stereotypical image that we all know of the later Marx with his big, grand, prophetic beard. I'll perhaps show some of those in some of the later PowerPoints, but I thought it would be a breath of fresh air to see him as he looked before that whole iconography developed. Marx was born in 1818 in the town of Trier in Germany, kind of middle-sized town. Those of you who know your European geography, Trier is about as far west in Germany as you can get. It's almost in Luxembourg and not very far from the French border and also not very far from the Belgian border. So we're talking northwestern Germany here. Perhaps ironically, given Marx's later political views, he was born into an upper middle class, affluent family in Trier. His father Heinrich was a prominent lawyer in the town, also owned several vineyards in the Mosel Valley. Interestingly enough, his mother, Henrietta Pressburg, was from a prominent and wealthy Dutch family, which was connected to the Philips family, famous for the electronics firm. Some of you may be listening to this lecture on Philips earbuds, or you may have shaved this morning using a Philishave electric razor, the ones with the little circular rotating blades on the top. Also made by the Philips company, and that's the family Philips is the family from which Marx's mum came from, interestingly enough. The Marx family was of Jewish descent. There are rabbis on both sides, especially on Marx's father's side. But Heinrich, who was originally called Herschel, Heinrich Marx had converted from Judaism earlier on in his life. Prussia went through one of these periods, unfortunately not unique, during which the political privileges and rights of the Jewish population were under threat and being rolled back. And so he converted to Christianity. And so Karl and his siblings were raised by Henrietta and Heinrich in Trier as baptized Lutherans in the Prussian church. But Heinrich Marx was a classical liberal in the Enlightenment tradition and was a largely secular man. So it's difficult to believe that their religious education came with much wholehearted support from their parents. Hard to think of the young Marx as being, really pushed in a strongly religious direction. Rather, he was raised in a largely secular family, but he's well aware of the Christian tradition and Christian religious doctrine. So it's well worth keeping that in mind when we talk about some of Marx's views about religion and alienation, which we'll come to in due course. Marx goes on to study at the University of Bonn and then eventually at the University of Berlin. There he is exposed to the philosophy of the dominant philosopher of early 19th century Germany, Georg Hegel. Eventually falls under the influence of a left-leaning group of Hegel disciples, often called the Young Hegelians. He goes on to write a doctoral dissertation, interestingly enough, on the materialist theories of the Hellenistic thinkers Democritus and Epicurus. That's actually quite important, as you perhaps know, for Marx's later materialism. I may comment on that later on in this series of lectures. After he's finished his PhD he writes it in Berlin, but he deposits the dissertation at the University of Jena for complicated reasons. After he finishes his education, he becomes an itinerant journalist and prominent communist political activist, moving from Germany to Paris, then Brussels, and eventually to London, where, of course, he spent the last part of his life, much of it in the reading room of the British Museum Library, writing and researching the institutions of modern capitalism and preparing the publication of his mammoth, never completed work, Das Kapital, which was intended to be, anyway, his definitive analysis of the institutions of modern capitalism and his critique of modern capitalism. And that's what, of course, gives him his significance in this course. Marx is certainly the greatest and still, in many ways, the most powerful modern critic of capitalist society. You've got to remember that by the time he's writing in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. It's transformed the landscape of economic, social, and political life in Western Europe. And all of the intellectuals of the 19th century in Europe are trying to come to terms with the implications of these sweeping changes. Some following Locke and Smith are great enthusiasts for all of this. Marx is one of the dissenting figures on the left, the most prominent of the dissenting figures on the left, who thinks that there's something profoundly wrong with the capitalist order that is coming to be, and with which, of course, we still live. And I'll be saying more about that in due course. Now, Marx's political impact is, of course, obvious to all of you. He's probably the most politically influential of all of the figures we've read. And this creates significant interpretative problems for us. You've got to remember that for much of the past 150 years, especially during the Cold War, Marxian doctrines have been strongly and officially opposed by the dominant institutions of the societies in which we live, the liberal democracies of the West. I grew up during the Cold War. The world was divided into two sectors, one dedicated to a certain kind of communism that at least claimed the blessing and inspiration of Karl Marx. And some of you still live. I mean, I'm giving these lectures, and some of you are listening to them in China. Some of you still live in societies that are at least officially still Marxist, communist societies. And on both sides, both in the West, in the sort of anti-Marxist, anti-communist liberal tradition, and of course in those societies that still are flying the flag of a certain kind of state socialism, a certain sort of Leninist, Maoist, Marxist communism, these are societies that have propagated various assumptions about Marx's own views, some of them critical, some of them affirmative, but almost all of which are quite misleading and often false. So what I want to do in this lecture is to try to help you liberate yourself from some of the preconceptions that this history will almost certainly have deposited in your mind, and that are likely to distort the way you read him and approach him. Because you're going to come to Marx with all kinds of expectations, and many of those expectations are really quite misleading. And it's important to recognize this, to try to come to terms with Marx's own thoughts in their own terms, because they're still extremely interesting. I should say that I don't want to be interpreted as saying that Marx is entirely blameless in all of this distortion. You know, he was a political activist, and part of the problem with combining the role of intellectual and philosopher on the one hand with that of an activist on the other, and hitching your intellectual project to a social and political movement, is that you give a huge hostage to fortune, right? You launch social movements, and you're then in a way at the mercy of the leaders of those later social movements, who are, of course, apt to distort and misrepresent and misunderstand what it was that you were actually saying. And I think that certainly has happened and Marx is partly to blame for this by associating his philosophical views with a certain political project. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is to try to identify several major assumptions that are quite likely to cloud your vision of his political theory, bring into your mind certain expectations, and those expectations, as I say, are very often misleading, and I want to disabuse you of them so that you can try to come to his texts and his ideas with fresh eyes. Because if you read him through the lens of these various traditions, the Western liberal tradition and the Soviet Marxist, Maoist, communist tradition, he becomes a much more boring and uninteresting figure in my view, and you'll miss a lot of what is of genuine interest in his ideas. And in the next lecture, I will talk about the influence of Hegel, whom I mentioned a moment ago, and that will begin the process of kind of attuning us to Marx's actual formation, some of the intellectual context that led him into the theory that he eventually developed. But the purpose of this lecture is just to try to identify in general some major expectations and assumptions that you should you should strive hard to try not to make as you approach your reading of Marx. And the myths and prejudices that I want to identify about Marx in this lecture are of two general kinds. On the one hand, there are a number of misleading assumptions and preconceptions about the kind of thinker that Marx was and about the sort of theory that he proposed. And at this first set of myths and prejudices, there are two I particularly want to emphasize. One comes from the left. It comes from his own followers, which his followers have very often wanted to depict Marx as a kind of genius prophet, right, with a fully worked out, infallible scientific doctrine that is completely internally coherent, completely transparent and worked out and developed, and that if we just read the text carefully enough, we'll see the truth, and everything will be hunky-dory. That's the sort of left-wing discipleship kind of view, and that's a mistake for reasons I get into in a moment. But there's also a right-wing mistake about the kind of thinker that Marx was and about the sort of theory that he proposed. This is the view that you very often hear implicit in a lot of conservative criticisms of Marx today, that Marx was a man who came into the world and offered a blueprint, a utopian formula for the ideal future society, a kind of prescription to be followed, and that's what Marx was really about. And as I'll show you in a moment, that's completely the wrong way to understand what Marx was up to. But there's another sort of myth or prejudice about Marxist thought, a different category of mistake that people fall into, which is not about the kind of thinker that Marx was or about the sort of theory he propounded, but rather consists simply in the false attributions of certain kinds of opinions to Marx. And you get this all the time. I mean, it leads me to despair. You turn on the media and you'll hear people referring to this or that as Marxist. And invariably, the things that are being attributed to Marx are things that Marx had no interest in whatsoever. There are four particular errors that I want to identify and talk a little bit about in this lecture and warn you against. One is Marx is very often depicted, especially by his right-wing critics, as some kind of egalitarian, and indeed an egalitarian of an extreme sort. That Marx is the sort of thinker who doesn't really care about freedom. He cares only about a kind of leveling down equality in which everybody is supposed to be, wearing the same clothes and miserable and but at least equal, right? And that's a complete fiction. There is, and I'll talk about all of these in a moment. Secondly, and sort of concomitantly, and I'll therefore deal with B1 and 2 together later on in the lecture, there's the view that Marx didn't really care about freedom, right? That he's a theorist of oppression and not really interested in individual freedom because he cares, for example, more about equality. And this is, again, completely wrong. Thirdly, not quite so obviously wrong, and it's understandable, I suppose, that many people are apt to attribute this sort of view to Marx. Many assume that Marx thought that capitalism and especially free markets are bad, wicked, and unjust. He certainly is a critic of commercial capitalism, but as we'll see, he doesn't think that they're unjust, and he doesn't even think that they're wholly bad. And I'll talk about that too in a moment. Finally, there's a tendency, again, especially on the right, to depict Marx as being committed to a very strong form of statism, right? To think of Marx as kind of Hobbes on steroids, right? That he's committed to the state control of everything, right? The state owning your body, the state owning all industry, the state planning the economy right down to, what your rations for tomorrow morning are supposed to be, how much bread you get, big government, right? Bureaucracy, right? Again, it's understandable perhaps why certain people on the right would tend to associate Marx with a commitment to statism of that kind. But again, as will become clear both in today's lecture and in some of the later lectures, I think there's no evidence whatsoever that Marx had any interest in that sort of dirigist statism. It's just not on his radar screen at all, I think, or if it is, it's as a fairly kind of minor theme in a theory whose major preoccupations are about something very, very different. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this lecture is just to go through these misleading assumptions one by one. So I'm going to start with A1 and A2 on your slide there, and then I'll, in the second, probably the final two-thirds of the session, talk about B1, 2, 3, and 4, although, as I say, I'll deal with B1 and 2 together because it makes sense to do so. So let me deal with A1. This is the sort of left-wing Soviet, communist, Maoist, Leninist tendency. These regimes and their leaders have, of course, understandably, since Marx is, as it were, their founder, right? I mean, the relationship between say, the Soviet Union and communist China in the old days, before Deng Xiaoping started to kind of open China up and liberalize it in various kinds of ways. The relationship between those regimes and Marx was in some ways a little bit like the relationship that you get in the United States today between the establishment and figures like Jefferson and Madison, right? These are depicted in America today, Madison and Jefferson, as the kind of genius legislators who set up this wonderful system. And in a similar vein, Marx is very often depicted in that way, deeply smart, deeply prophetic, a kind of systematic theorist with a fully worked out scientific doctrine far in advance of his time, who worked everything out and from whose wisdom these regimes derive their legitimacy. This obviously is close to a kind of religious conception of Marx, right? It's Marx as Jesus, right? It's Marx as the sort of founding figure in this tradition. All the credit goes to him, right? For these wonderful regimes that we've created, right? And the element in this sort of left wing hagiographic story about Marx, the element that I particularly want to pick out and criticize and warn you against, is the picture that, understandably, they've wanted to propound of Marx as a systematic theorist with a coherent, fully worked out, perhaps scientific doctrine that has worked everything out for us. On this kind of view, Marx is kind of the Darwin of the social sciences, who uncovered for us the laws of motion of human history. Marx sometimes suggests this sort of reading. If you look at the Marx-Engels reader, pages 4 to 5, in the little section that is entitled in that reader, The History of My Own Opinions, Marx gives a quick summary of his general theory, and especially on his view that it's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. I'll say more about what that means in future lectures. And that is indeed a good overview of his general theory. And when Marx talks about it, he sometimes comes across somewhat immodestly as saying, I'm the first guy to have figured out this deep truth about how human history develops. But this is also a very misleading picture of his theory as a whole, I want to suggest. Even in the passage from the Marx-Engels reader, pages 4 to 5 that I just mentioned, Marx only says that his working hypothesis, as he puts it, served as a guiding thread for my studies. He doesn't really elaborate it with any great specificity, and it's fairly clear, I think, that the general hypothesis is compatible with many different possible interpretations. So even that passage doesn't really commit Marx to anything of any great definiteness. And he goes on to say, look, my hypothesis can be determined with the precision of natural science, but I've put the emphasis there on can be. I don't think there's very much evidence that Marx thought that he had himself completely and beyond all dispute determined exactly how his hypothesis works out. He's committed in that passage anyway only to the view that it can in principle be precisely observed and understood on something like an empirical natural scientific basis. But he's leaving open the question of what kind of specific theory you need in order to be able to determine with that degree of precision. And I think more generally, and in a way this is the most important point, right? This image of Marx as a kind of genius prophet who saw everything already, and all we have to do is to consult his texts in the way that some religious adherents consult the Gospels as if they're completely true, beyond all question, fully worked out, infallible, etc., right? That image of Marx as a thinker just can't survive, I think, even a cursory glance at his actual texts. Marx was a tremendously restless thinker, right? He was constantly tinkering, fiddling around with, updating his views in the light of historical developments, in the light of his own dissatisfaction with his own theory. And I think that the idea that what Marx leaves us with is a kind of integrated, coherent edifice of philosophical ideas that all fits coherently together as a perfect package, that's just a completely distorted picture of what Marx actually accomplished. What I see when I read Marx's various different texts is not a coherent single doctrine that is fully worked out with gem-like transparency. What I see is something that looks much more like a rather half-finished building site with lots of different, admittedly very arresting and striking structures, but relatively few of which are fully articulated and many are left unfinished. And of course, the story of Das Kapital, which I mentioned earlier on, is, I think, entirely characteristic. He could never decide how many volumes it was supposed to have. At some point, it was supposed to have 6, 7 volumes. Then he kind of shaved it down to 3 volumes. But of course, 2 of those volumes he never finished in his own life. And Engels had to try to kind of piece them together from the fragments that Marx left. And we know now that Engels kind of mucked around with them and altered them in various ways. So Marx was an experimentalist. He wasn't somebody who was fully satisfied with his own doctrine. And so this idea that has been propagated by especially communist regimes, that he knew all the answers in advance and gave us this perfectly coherent doctrine, that's just a complete myth. And it cannot be reconciled, I submit to you, with the actual historical record, with his actual manuscripts, which are just much more of a mess, much more of a mess than that story would have us believe. I think it's also important to remember the slightly odd publication record of Marx's works. Many of the works we read today, including the works we read in this class, like the German ideology and the economic and philosophical manuscripts, were not published until the 1930s, long after Marx's death and long after various powerful communist regimes, especially the Soviet Union and East Germany, were established. So they were published in the 1930s. They weren't really significantly discussed until the 50s and 60s, right? Much of Marx's writings have yet to be published. There's this project going on right now to publish all of Marx's writings, this the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, which is still ongoing. It will eventually run to something like 120 volumes. So there's still an awful lot of Marx that we haven't yet really absorbed. Again, I think you have to conclude that this picture of Marx having this fully worked out theory in the 19th century, and all we have to do is to just sort of go and read his texts in the way that certain kind of really hardline scriptural originalist Christians might look at the Bible. That's completely the wrong way to think about Marx's oeuvre in my judgment. So that's A1. The other myth and misleading prejudice about the kind of theory that Marx offered us is a myth that has been propagated especially on the conservative right. And I have in mind here the complaint which you see all the time on Fox News and similar kinds of outlets, the complaint that, for example, every time communism has been tried, it has failed, right? And that complaint derives its plausibility from 2 claims that I can't fault it for. There are 2 generalizations that are kind of contained within this sort of standard complaint, which seem to me to be, broadly speaking, plausible. One is that communist regimes, especially of the 21st century variety, have rarely been economically very successful, and they've often economically collapsed, as was the case, for example, in the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union. And they've often also been horrible, objectionably repressive regimes. And I don't think there's any point in trying to deny that. So that's certainly something I don't want to dispute. And to the extent that the every time communism has been tried, it has failed complaint is pointing to that phenomenon, it seems to me to be entirely on target and not very interesting to dispute. The other thing that the conservative objection, I think, gets right in general is an underlying principle. What the complaint is getting at is the thought that, look, if the souffle, if every time you try the souffle collapses, then it follows there must be something wrong with the recipe, right? I mean, that's the underlying principle. And again, that principle is entirely correct, right? I mean, if you keep trying a certain recipe, and every single damn time the recipe doesn't come out right, well, then you're justified in concluding that there's something wrong with the recipe. So I can't fault the conservative line on either of those points. So don't misunderstand me on both those points. the conservative criticism seems to me to be on target. But the problem with the conservative collapsing souffle critique is that it applies to Marx's own philosophical thought itself only if one assumes that he was offering a recipe, that he was offering a blueprint or a prescription, something that is to be applied, something that we take, a kind of formula for how to run an ideal society, and then we take that formula and then we apply it, right? But that assumption as a guide to what Marx actually said and what he was up to is, I suggest to you, completely misleading and picking up Marx completely by the wrong handle. Notoriously, Marx says next to nothing about communism or about an ideal communist society. I mean, there are a few stray passages here and there where he gestures in that direction, but these are very, very cryptic and very underdeveloped passages compared to the rest of his writings. And he spends a lot of time, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, deriding utopian socialists for building castles in the air, as he puts it. You'll see him say that in the Communist Manifesto. Mostly, Marx writes about capitalism. And the main question that he wished to raise was not how do you design a recipe for an ideal communist society. That's not his main concern at all. His main concern is to draw attention to what he sees as the oppressive, irrational character of commercial capitalism as it has developed in the 19th century. He's a critic rather than a prescriber, right? And and I think we should take him at his word, right? I mean, that's what he's really trying to do in most of his mature philosophical writings, to analyze, dissect, and expose as wanting capitalist societies. Perhaps not surprising that capitalist apologists want to beat up on Marx for the failure of communist societies, right? Maybe they focus on that because they wanted to distract attention from what Marx really wrote about, which was not about the virtues of a communist utopia, but rather about the vices and pathologies and perversity of capitalism itself. And I think, as I say, we should take Marx at his word and read him not as someone who is devising a recipe for a communist souffle for the future, a kind of blueprint, but rather as someone who wants to identify vitiating flaws in the capitalist system under which we still live. Probably the Communist Manifesto, which I did ask you to look at for this week, is the closest we get in Marx's writings to anything that looks like a kind of blueprint or a prescription. And there are moments in that text which seem to make certain kinds of prescriptions and demands. But you have to remember that the Communist Manifesto is not a philosophical treatise. It's a work of political mobilization. It's a work of Marx the activist and not of Marx the social theorist or the social analyst or the political philosopher. So it's already unclear how much we should credit that text when we're trying to figure out what Marx the philosopher actually thought about politics and economics. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Secondly, when you actually look at the proposals that the Communist Manifesto makes, some of them are indeed fairly radical and point in some respects, admittedly, towards some ideas that were pursued, often with very limited success, by communist regimes in the 20th century. But many of the others are remarkably moderate by contemporary standards. For example, the Communist Manifesto calls for a progressive income tax, for free public education, for nationalized transportation, right, communications, national banks, something, again, that we largely have come to take for granted. So, the Communist Manifesto is a bit of a false friend for those who want to criticize Marx for his radicalism, because a lot of the proposals that it contains are things that actually we've absorbed into basic common sense in many modern Western societies today. And it's also important to keep in mind, as Marx makes very clear, that the various proposals that are made in that passage in the Communist Manifesto are clearly not intended as a description of a fully developed communist society. Marx clearly regards them as transitional, temporary policies that pave the way for something else and are not part of his prescription for an ideal. That's something that he says precious little about, although you could, of course, certainly complain about him that it would have been nice had he said a little bit more about the ideal. But this, for philosophical reasons that I'll explain later, he refuses on principle to do. So let me turn now to the false substantive attributions, the ones I gathered under B in my earlier slide. And I want to take B1 and B2 together. These are the ones about Marx as an extreme egalitarian and as an enemy of freedom. The way this is sometimes put is in terms of the famous slogan of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? That's the great French revolutionary slogan. It kind of sets the agenda for the 19th century. And one common way of putting the various ideologies that developed politically in the 19th century after the French Revolution is to say, well, you can see the split between classical liberalism on the one hand and communism and socialism on the other as dividing over the relative importance of these three French revolutionary principles, right? So on that view, classical liberalism emphasizes freedom and liberty, whereas Marx and the communists emphasize equality and fraternity. And that's a standard way of thinking about the ideologies of the 19th century. Unfortunately, it's completely implausible and doesn't really work very well for Marx at all. With regard to equality and egalitarianism, to my knowledge, Marx nowhere advocates any sort of leveling down distributive equality, according to which everybody being equal in the sense of how much money they make, or anything of that kind, or having equality of resources, right? Marx just isn't interested in distributive questions of that sort at any level, and he certainly isn't a kind of crude egalitarian who says that all should be, receive the same income, right? I mean, there's just nothing anywhere I know in Marx where anything of that sort is advocated. In the Critique of the Gotha program, he approvingly cites a distributive principle, which again he doesn't elaborate very much, but which he does associate with his favored communist view. And that principle is a famous one. It's the from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs principle. And he says, look, in a communist society, that would be, if anything, the principle of distribution within a communist society. But if you actually look at that principle and ask, well, is there anything egalitarian about that? I don't think you'll come back with an affirmative answer, right? Because after all, people's needs are not the same. Some people have very expensive needs. Other people have very cheap needs. And of course, people's abilities differ from each according to his abilities. Well, does that mean that we're expecting that everybody is going to have to contribute the same? Well, it's certainly not obvious, right? So I don't think that the one statement of a distributive principle that you find in Marx, which is this from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs principle, that doesn't look even just superficially as any sort of egalitarian principle of distribution. I'll talk about this more in later lectures, but Marx himself regards the commitment to abstract equality as a typically classical liberal commitment. It's part of what he wishes to criticize, right? So, it's far from it being the case that Marx is some kind of egalitarian. He spends a great deal of time criticizing egalitarianism because he regards certain ideals of abstract equality as characteristically bourgeois, as characteristic of classical liberal capitalist ideology, which he's seeking to oppose. There's this passage from the Grundrisse, which is a sort of a set of notebooks that he wrote before he was, or as he was compiling Das Kapital, And early on there, Marx describes, broadly speaking, capitalist classical liberal ideology in the following terms. And it's important to keep in mind he's criticizing this. Right? This is the object, this is the target of his criticism. He's not defending this view. This is what he fully understands as the view that he's trying to reject. He says that in bourgeois ideology and capitalist society, subjects are posited as exchanges, equals, such that they themselves are of equal worth and assert themselves in the act of exchange as equally worthy, whatever other individual distinction there may be between them. They are, as equals, at the same time also indifferent to one another. Whatever other individual distinction there may be does not concern them. They are indifferent to all of their other individual peculiarities. Although individual A feels the need for commodity of individual B, he doesn't appropriate it by force, nor vice versa, but rather they recognize one another reciprocally as equal proprietors, right? So keep in mind that when Marx uses the term equality, he's very much using it to identify his critical target. He's much more a critic of egalitarianism, seems to me, than he is a defender of some kind of egalitarianism. You'll also notice in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, this is on page 83 of your Marx Engels reader, Marx speaks there very dismissively of what he calls crude communism as a, quote, consummation of envy and, quote, the urge to reduce to a common level. And he rejects this, and he rejects it on the grounds that it reestablishes what he calls the avarice, the possessiveness, the acquisitiveness of capitalist private property. And it's quite clear from the context that that's something that he wishes to overcome, right? So this idea that Marx is committed to a kind of envious leveling down egalitarianism is very hard to reconcile with that passage. And you also have to keep in mind, and I'll be emphasizing this in the lectures to come, that Marx's critique of capitalism is far more advanced on behalf of freedom than it is advanced on behalf of any kind of ideal of equality. He's aware that classical liberalism, figures like Locke, whom we've already encountered, Adam Smith, and other apologists for capitalism today, well, he's not aware of them today, but it's still true, as it was in his day, that apologists for capitalism and classical liberalism advertise their outlook as libertarian in the sense of being committed to individual freedom. But it's a mistake to think of Marx as saying, well, the problem with these folks is that they care about liberty, whereas what we should think about is, and care about, is equality. That's not his move at all. His move, as I've just said, is quite suspicious of equality, which he thinks of as part of the problem. His main aim is not to advance equality rather than liberty. His main aim is to claim that the capitalist pretense of freeing people is hypocrisy, right? Freedom is claimed in capitalist society, but this claimed freedom is actually a masquerade. Supposed freedom under capitalism is actually domination and oppression. And viewed from that angle, Marx's clear goal is to advanced. His arguments, his criticisms of capitalism are advanced on behalf of freedom. So much for B1 and B2. Let me turn now to the third claim, right? So this is the claim that we all know Marx is a critic of capitalism, and so people then rush to the conclusion that Marx must be condemning capitalism as immoral or unjust. And, you know, there may be something to this way of reading Marx. Certainly some very smart people have read him that way. But as we'll see, and as I'll be emphasizing, this is a controversial way of reading Marx, and that it actually swims very strongly against some of the major currents of his views on capitalism. It's far from obvious, and it's very likely wrong, that Marx intended a critique of capitalism that says, well, the problem with capitalism is that it's immoral, or that it's wicked, or that capitalists behave unethically, right? That is not, I think, Marx's likely intention. And let me just say a couple of reasons for thinking this. One is that if there's one consistent strand in Marx's writings, it's a repudiation of what he calls moralizing criticism. And by moralizing criticism, he means criticisms of individual behavior that are couched in terms of ethical or moral duties or obligations. He thinks that kind of talk is kind of pointless for various reasons I'll be getting into. But in the context of capitalism, I think the point is fairly easy to see. Consider the capitalist who lays off his workers because the business is failing, right? He's responsible to his shareholders. The business is in danger of going bust. The only way the business can survive is to let go 15% of the workforce, cut down on labor costs, and maybe we'll struggle to survive, right? Now, Marx thinks it's pointless to criticize the capitalist factory owner who lays off 15% of his workforce because he has to, otherwise the business is going to go under. It's pointless bleating on morally about what an awful, horrible, ethically bad thing that is to do, because the capitalist in this situation doesn't really have a choice, right? I mean, it may well be that the capitalist in this case is an absolute arsehole bastard who doesn't care about his workforce, but it's just as possible that the capitalist is in this case someone who knows and cares about his workers. And the last thing he personally wants to do is to lay them off and send them packing and leave them to destitution. It may give them an enormous amount of pain. The point is that if he's to run his business as the system requires, he has to do it, because otherwise the business will go under, right? Marx is very often wanting to say that the problem with capitalism is that it makes human beings behave in certain kinds of ways. It compels certain kinds of problematic behavior. But of course, if our behavior is in that way determined by the system, then people don't really have much choice about how they're supposed to behave. And it doesn't really make sense then to hold them morally culpable for behavior within the system that we regard as ethically problematic. And that is a stable feature of Marx's view. Now, I'll get into this in more detail in later lectures. But generally speaking, Marx has a view under which what counts as just and unjust in any given historical situation depends on the prevailing beliefs about justice that are socially accepted at different historical periods. And he regards these beliefs about justice as aspects of what he calls the ideologies that the regnant economic system tends to erect around them. And in that sense, as we're going to see when we talk about Marx's analysis of wage labor and the relations between wage laborers and capitalists, it turns out that Marx, in a funny kind of way, actually agrees with capitalists that the subsistence wage that factory workers receive under capitalism is indeed the just wage. Part of his point, as we'll see when we get to this, is that Marx is not saying that the capitalist treats his workers unjustly. To the contrary, his argument is that capitalism is a system in which what counts as justice gives everybody exactly what they're entitled to. But he then wants to go on to say that capitalist justice in that sense is deeply problematic for other reasons, right? And that strongly supports the conclusion that Marx doesn't think that capitalism is inherently just or unjust. Rather, he wants to criticize it on independent grounds, not by invoking some abstract principle of justice. And in fact, I think that is in fact the right way to read Marx, that he's not applying a principle of justice at all. And that's why he goes out of his way to say, no, workers in capitalism, they can't complain that they're being unjustly treated. And that may come as a big surprise to you, but that is in fact part of Marx's view, and I'll come around to that when we get to his analysis of capitalism. The final thing to say about B3 is that Marx recognizes that capitalist markets are highly productive and have massively amplified human capability and human power. When you read the first few pages of the Communist Manifesto, you can see that Marx has more than a grudging admiration for capitalism and what market society has achieved. And he certainly doesn't think of them as wholly bad. He does want to point out some deep and profound oppressive features, but those oppressive features sit alongside various kinds of accomplishments that Marx is very happy to celebrate. And I'll talk more about that in later lectures as well. So let me end with the final of the substantive errors that I want to talk about, and I'll have to be a bit quicker about this one. This fourth one is the picture of Marx as a kind of craven statist who wants the state to control everything from above. And you get that kind of assumption refracted in the standard complaint that, look, the collapse of the command economies, the planned societies of the Eastern Bloc, the Chinese government's turn towards free markets, all of this is used as evidence that Marx's prediction about the inevitability and superiority of state planning was totally way off. But this general view also rests on, I think, a completely misleading set of assumptions about what Marx actually thought about the state. Although Marx says very little, as I've already indicated, about what an ideal communist society would look like, he does make it reasonably clear that in such an ideal communist society, a state in anything like a modern Hobbesian sense would be unnecessary. It would cease to have its function any longer. He says it would wither away, right? And so the idea that Marx is interested in exacerbating state control is very, very hard to reconcile with that very clear commitment of Marx to a society in which the state as we know it would cease to be a necessary institution. And it's important to keep in mind that many of Marx's followers were anarchists. They thought that an ideal communist society would precisely be one that didn't require state bureaucracy in the way that we understand it. And for reasons that will emerge in the course of my lectures, my own view is that Marx would not have been at all surprised at the failure of state planning in the 20th century command economy sort of sense, nationalization of industry, strategic planning of production by the state, price controls, all of this. I think Marx would have recognized that that was a non-starter from the beginning, and I'll explain my reasons for thinking this down the road. But I think you can make a very good case that Marx's theory of capitalism predicts something that we have, in fact, precisely observed over the last 50 years, that this sort of neoliberal turn in Western liberal democratic societies. He would, I think, have predicted, and I think correctly, that the 20th century effort to mobilize the Hobbesian state, the modern state, to curb capitalism and control it and keep it within certain constraints, that effort to use the institutional hardware of the modern state to try to control capitalism and keep it within certain bounds, that effort has very, very definite limits, right? Because ultimately, Marx's position is that in the capitalist epoch, which surely he would today say we still live under, his basic point is that it's not the state that controls us. The state is just a kind of subordinate branch of the capitalist system. What really governs our lives in modern society is the capitalist market. And he thinks that since the state is simply a creature of the market, we shouldn't expect it to be able to do very much by way of abolishing or modifying the capitalist system itself. But I'll say a lot more about that in the lectures ahead. Suffice it to say that I think that the traditional view that Marx's predictions were way off target is in fact not really a plausible view. To the contrary, I think that Marx's theory offers some pretty astute predictions about precisely why the effort to control the market by means of the state in the 20th century were doomed to fail. But I'll talk more about that, of course, in future lectures, and I have to stop now. Thank you.